The following program is presented to you by the New York State School Boards Association.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us to this particular webinar, which is entitled Bridging the Equity Divide Through Board Policy. As many of you know, you've been tuning in to hear a number of other webinars on this topic, but because we are the New York State School Boards Association, and because school boards are basically put on this earth to promulgate policies, we thought it would be incomplete for us to have a conversation about how we would bridge the equity divide without talking to you specifically about board policy. So I'm graced today with Jessica Goldstein, who is our Deputy Director of Policy Services for the New York State School Boards Association, Mary Williams-Noi, who's a policy consultant, and my good friend, Dr. Oliver Robinson, who's the superintendent of the Shenendehowa School District. There's not a conference or a meeting that Oliver is not willing to participate in and help us out, and he's a dear friend of our organization. We're also very, very pleased that the Utica National Insurance Group has agreed, as it has agreed for all of the conferences that we've held on this topic, to be our supporter and to be our sponsor. So to Utica National, we greatly appreciate all of your assistance and all of your work. So let me get you started here because we only have about an hour. And I thought I would start this conversation by talking to you a little bit about the background of this particular topic. So Mary Williams-Noi, who's been on our staff, how many years, Mary, have you been with us?
It'll be 25 years in January.
Just a couple of years, just a couple of years.
Just 25 a few.
God bless you. So Mary had been looking at the whole issue of equity, diversity, inclusivity, figuring out what districts could do better. And so, Mary, what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about, first of all, is what precipitated the decision on your behalf to start looking at developing an equity policy. And particularly as you talk about that, I'm interested in the timing, of when you started thinking about this.
Okay. So actually, I came across this topic probably a few years back while I was doing some research on non-discrimination. I found an amazing policy that was written by the Montgomery County Public Schools in Maryland on non-discrimination. This policy, it moved me. This policy spoke to everything I wanted to feel as a person of color. I felt a feeling of respect, a feeling of dignity, inclusion, and value. I remember thinking to myself, why doesn't NYSSBA have this policy for its membership, but most importantly for the children of the state of New York? So I brought it to Jessica's attention and then the rest of the policy department. And as a group, we decided to place it on our list of future topics.
Yeah, so what's really important about what you just said is my second question. And again, folks, I want to set a context as to why we're presenting this to you today. And I'm going to get Oliver to chime in just a few minutes as to the superintendent's perspective as to why it's important to superintendents across the state. So we know, right, that recently there has been an amplified social justice movement that we've seen in this country, and people of all races have joined that movement. We've seen a whole bunch of atrocities that have been flashing across our screens. This is something we've dealt with for a whole bunch of years. But Jessica, Mary, is it free to say, is it appropriate, excuse me, for me to say that your thought about engaging in this work came even before all of those particular issues? Yeah,
of course. Actually, we wanted to release it in March, but due to COVID-19, it actually was pushed back until September. So, but I do believe the recent social movement has helped to bring around a new awareness and maybe open up a few more hearts to the minded issues of inequities.
Yes, and on that basis, I think it is fair to say, and I think we all believe this, that people should have had within their hearts an inclination to try to do this good work, but we do know that one of the things we can focus upon, given all of these recent issues that we've been facing as a nation, is that people perhaps are more receptive now. So now perhaps it's the time. So Mary, just go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask you though is what kind of sources did you consult in developing our materials? Because as people look at this, and Jessica's going to walk us through this, I want them to get a sense of what's involved and what they're about to see unveiled to them.
So I did a lot of research. I gathered lots of sources, news articles. I read a lot of research papers. I looked at a lot of frameworks, read articles from State Education Department, the National Equity Project, just to name a few, Harvard University. I looked at a lot of our sister and brother state associations like Maryland, Arizona, Texas, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and a lot of state and national organizations, Seattle, their policies, Portland, and a lot of New York State local policies.
Okay, and when you look through all that stuff, we obviously wanted to give our members the very best of the best. So what did you see in those materials? This is at 30,000 feet, but what did you see in those materials that you believe constituted great strengths, and what might have constituted some weaknesses that we decided not to focus upon?
Well, so for an outsider looking through the window, I found that some policies were kind of broad. And they promised some too much. Some were on point. There were some that played it safe, and a lot of them did not really acknowledge the historical issues that contributed to the inequities within society. But I think for the most part, they all were there to support children and to affect change.
Right. So all of their intentions might have been good, but what I hear you saying is we wanted to make sure we provided some materials that would really place us in the best possible position. And I guess one of my final questions for you before I ask Oliver his thoughts too, would be, can you just walk us through how these materials are structured? I know Jessica's going to walk us through the specifics of the policy and the regulations, and we're going to let her do that, but just give us that 30,000-foot view.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Jessica's going to walk us through those, but we were careful to consider what was policy and what was considered a plan. So looking at the policies, it was important to me, especially, that it was not about blame or shame, but I wanted everything especially to be about hope and possibility and for a better future for society as a whole. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Robertson, especially personally for me, because he was very supportive throughout this entire project, and he was great.
Well, I appreciate you. I appreciate you making that comment, because I was just about to say the same thing. So I'll just piggyback on that and say that as soon as we started talking about providing policies for school districts, we know that nothing happens in a district without a cohesive relationship between a superintendent and the Board of Education. If the board really wants to do something and the superintendent doesn't, it's probably not going to happen, and vice versa. But this is an issue of great resolve for us, because as you expressed, Mary, we truly believe that with what we've seen across our television screens, public education is and I don't mean I mean the vehicle to change the trajectory for the future. So I gave Oliver a call, and I know that you did as well, Mary, and we said, hey, Oliver, I know that you work with the Inclusivity and Diversity Commission of the Superintendent's Organization. And there's some individuals on that committee that are truly amazing. And Oliver is one of them. Laval Brown is another individual who is spectacular in his resolve to this as well. But Oliver, walk us through what your thoughts were and why this work is important, and how you have committed yourself with the Superintendent's Organization, the New York State Council of School Superintendents, to work with us to ensure that this gets done.
Thank you very much, Jay. First of all, I would like to also acknowledge Mary for putting it together. And for us, when I say us, NYSCOSS, New York State Council of School Superintendent, the marriage with NYSSBA was a natural one that, quite frankly, should have been there much stronger all through time, particularly surrounding this issue. So upon hearing the work that Mary is doing, we thought this was a perfect timing. And ironically, Mary mentioned they wanted to unveil it in March. As it turned out, delaying it was actually much more effective, because it gave us an opportunity for the two organizations to come together, the the Commission on Diversity and Inclusivity that I chair with Lavelle Brown from Ithaca, we were doing some very similar things. And in fact, we were researching some equity policies to push out for superintendents to start to share with their boards. And so we were working towards the same objective, but ironically from different directions. It was most appropriate, I think, or should I say it is most appropriate for NYSSBA to actually come out and take the policy lead. And it's my hope that the 700 plus school districts across the state will take heed and look at this policy and adopt it as a way to start the conversations within their communities. And when I say community, not only the school community, but the community at large. Because oftentimes the challenge to go from rhetoric to action is the embrace of the community. And so this provides board members with a tremendous resource, a guide, if you will, roadmap to start having those conversations, to start leaning into those conversations, and to start supporting superintendents to carry out those conversations. Because I know many colleagues across the state want to have the conversation, but they struggle because of the disconnect between their perspective and the perspective of the board. So if this can help bridge, as you know, the title of this presentation talks about bridging the equity divide, this is also going to bridge the leadership governance divide and having everyone on the same page, trying to address what I think is the most significant issue of our time, ensuring that we have equity in education, that we addressing the discriminatory practices that have unfortunately rendered so many young people as failures within our systems. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for both parties to come together.
And I want to also say, Oliver, and not to cut you off because you may have a couple other things, but I wanted to say that this has been a resolve of my corporate board of directors. And our president is Fred Langstaff. He's from Long Island. And each time we get a new president, they have a new theme. And his is all about this whole equity divide. And it's not just a passing of time that we want to spend on this. This is really a mission that we are very much driven for. In fact, our board of directors is going to be holding a retreat starting tomorrow. And this is going to be the subject matter of how we can bridge this divide. There's nothing more important for our children. There's nothing that constitutes fairness when it comes to kids who live in a particular area who, you know, from the day they're born, they're not going to get a fair shot, and it's not acceptable. And again, we can do a better job of that. So Oliver, anything else you wanted to say before I turn it over to Jessica? And we're going to ask you to chime in as Jessica is going through this, because from your perspective, we want to know from an administrative perspective what the board members who are listening in today might want to take heed of, so that they won't just adopt a policy. They're going to be really positioned to make sure they have success. Okay, so without you having anything else to say, I can count on you hopefully to chime in for you. So Jessica, how many years have you been at the School Boards Association?
I lost track, but I know it's over 20.
Yeah, so you've been here. You're an old timer also, just like I am. And I think we have a great longevity at the School Boards Association because for the folks listening to any of the things that we do, you probably know we feel this in our heart. We feel this in our souls, and this is the work that we have all committed ourselves to. And Jessica, it is a pleasure to work with you. So why don't you start walking us through, the audience members through what is going to constitute the policy and the regulations. And by the way, folks, if you have questions, put those into the questions and answers box there. And we have Courtney Sanick, who is the third individual who is working with us on this right now. We have another individual who is on a childbearing leave. But Courtney Sanick is going to be sending me via text your questions, and I'll make sure I interrupt either Jessica or Oliver. If you have a question that demonstrates to me confusion, then it bears interruption. Otherwise, we'll wait sort of to the end. So if you see me looking at my electronic device, no, I'm not going to be checking the scores of some game. I am going to be trying to make sure we get your questions. Go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you. So I wanted to let you know, number one, that this policy, regulation, and exhibit that we've developed are both available on the NYSSBA website. They should also have been available via a link to the registration materials, and they are available under the handout section, as well as a PDF of this PowerPoint. So just wanted to call your attention to that. And so as I mentioned, there's a policy and a regulation and an exhibit, and we'll go over them in that order. And I do want to acknowledge and thank the work that Mary put into this. You know, she brought it to our attention, and she was really the driving factor to say this is something that we really need to look at, and to bring us along as a team to say this is not the same thing as equal opportunity. Equity is a different topic, and I'm sure that many of you have seen an illustration like this following up on the screen here, that equality is giving everybody the same thing, but it's not really what they need. And so equity is giving students, in this case, the tools that they need to survive, and recognizing that through no fault of their own, students come to school with different levels and different engagements, and it's up to schools to meet them where they are. And particularly when you look at what schools are required to do as far as federal funding and the Every Student Succeeds Act, which actually was, before that it was the No Child Left Behind Act. School districts have to look at where are the achievement gaps. So No Child Left Behind came out in the year 2001. So we've been really having to look at our achievement gaps since for a long time now, almost 20 years. And if we haven't really made a lot of progress, then we need to look at what do we need to do differently. So an equity policy is a good place to start because it is a statement from the board. It is, let's get everybody on the same page. Let's work in the same direction. Let's be intentional about it. And instead of just, random acts of improvement, let's look at a plan to look at our data and what does our data tell us. So I'm going to walk you through what the main points of the policy are. That for starters, it's a commitment from the board to the principles of equity for a positive and inclusive learning environment where all students feel safe and welcomed and accepted, but also feel that they experience belonging and academic success, that they feel that school is a place where they belong and not a place for somebody else. So we start out with some generally accepted agreements and beliefs, and that's all children deserve an equal access to opportunity, which is a good starting point. But additionally, to recognize that there have been some groups that in society and in schools that have been historically marginalized, and that historical marginalization has led to some of the achievement gaps that we see today. That additionally, there is no place in school for racism, discrimination, and marginalization, and that the board has a commitment to addressing these inequities and to help students equitably access the learning opportunities.
And Jessica, if I could just interrupt for 1 second and forgive me. This slide is so important, folks, because I get phone calls all the time from board members when they're upset about different societal issues, and they'll say, what do we stand for? And if you look at this slide, the introduction of this policy allows you to answer that question. This is what we stand for, right? And I think that's an important starting point. And go ahead, Jessica. Sorry to interrupt.
No, absolutely, thank you. It's good to hear your perspective too, because I know that you have people, school board members and superintendents calling you all the time. These are our concerns, so it's good that we can reflect that. So we'll start out like we do in many policies with goals. What is the goal of the equity policy? And these are so the first start. There's another slide here about the different goals that you might have to have an equitable, inclusive, and diverse opportunities for all students to reach their highest potential, and to acknowledge the cultural diversity that exists in your school district, and that they need to find relevant connections between themselves and their schoolwork in order to be successful. and that the district then wants to create culturally responsive learning and working environments. And that goes hand in hand with expecting and supporting high academic achievement for all students and employees as well. So Oliver, did anything here, speak to you as a superintendent and looking at like the board superintendent relationship?
Yes, Jessica. Actually, I'm gonna make a comment related to this slide, and just to go back to the other slide. You don't have to go back to the other slide, but it's related. It's an important point, because when you think about the topic of equity, often what I hear from people saying, well, we're not a very diverse school district, so why should we even have this conversation? And I think that slide, the previous slide, it talks about if we truly do value and believe that all students, and the key is that all students deserve an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to be in an environment that they are respected, appreciated for who they are and what they bring to the table. That enough says it all in terms of the need for every school district to be addressing this. Unfortunately, people are still very much in this kind of very binary perspective, or of, either yes or no. It's not. When you think about issues of culture, issues of diversity, issues of race, ironically, sometimes people think race and it only refers to someone who's Black or non-white. And I always say, well, so therefore white people don't have race. White is a racial category. And so it's kind of interesting how I say that, because as a superintendent and boards, we have to change our paradigm in terms of how we look at culture, how we look at diversity, but more importantly, where our kids are going. It's not where our kids are, it's where they're going, and what are we truly preparing them for when they leave the walls and the comforts of our communities.
Thank you. That's exactly the point that that we try to make as well. Actually, at our annual convention that we held just a few weeks ago, I did a policy roundup of all the different policy topics we talked about, and equity being one of them. And I asked people, where are you in your equity journey? Does this not apply to you? Is it something you're already doing, or are you talking about it? And a good number of people said this doesn't really apply to us. And I made that same point. You may not have a very diverse student body now, but that doesn't mean that you won't in the future. And where are your students going? You want to prepare them for life outside of the district, because you don't know where life will take them. So we'll continue on with some more of the goals of our policy here. That the board and its employees are going to understand the historical inequities or inequalities that shape today's society, and recognize and eliminate some of the institutional barriers that contribute to disparate outcomes in the district. And that additionally, that curriculum and instructional materials should reflect the diversity of people, perspectives, and experiences, and examined for bias. And as Oliver said, this is not necessarily dependent on how diverse your school district is. Seeing people who are different from you reflected in the curriculum, and also seeing people who are seeing the curriculum that reflects who you are, is very powerful in terms of preparing students for life outside of the district.
Mary, can I offer one quick point before you transition? Because I think that first bullet point is such a critical point. Board and employees understand historical inequalities that shape today's society. That keyword, understand, is probably the most significant word in that. That means people taking the time to study, and not assumptions based upon what we were told, or assumptions based upon the running narrative within our small circles. But truly, when you think about education, we are a learning community. This is basically saying boards and superintendents and district leaders, they must become a part of them, have that learning journey to understand that. Because I've heard where people say, I've had people ask me, is that like a Black thing? Well, if you want to limit it to that much, that kind of tells me that you're not intended to broaden your own horizon. So the question then is, for all members of our learning communities, is our willingness to lean into these uncomfortable conversations, to lean into our lack of knowledge, and knowing that we have to commit ourselves to be learners, because you really can't appreciate something until you understand it. And understanding comes from accumulation of knowledge. And so that point is so key for boards to really set aside and say, what do I know? What do we know? And how do we expand our cognitive horizons?
Thank you for underscoring that. That's very important. And you're right. You know, some people might think, oh, equity issues, it's all about race, and it is a big part of the conversation, but that's not the entire conversation. And so, you know, for a school district to look at the totality of the students within there and say who is not doing as well as others. You don't want any sort of characteristic to be a determining factor of how successful a student is. And so regardless of what that might be, you're not going to know until you ask the question, until you examine those things and as Oliver said, engage in that learning process. So another part of the policy is about accountability, transparency, and review. That it's an accepting of responsibility. That students they have access to what they need, and the district will commit the time and energy and resources to make it happen. Further, that you may need a committee. You could have a district-wide and a school-level committee who is charged with looking at these issues specifically, and that will assist in developing any prevention initiatives and any remedies that might be necessary in your policies or in your practices. You know, we have been asked, you know, oh, has NYSSBA looked at their policies through an equity lens? And we are starting to do that, and we will continue to do that. But you know, just because a policy might be neutrally written on its face doesn't mean that there aren't inequalities that happen in the implementation. So you have to look at practices throughout your whole district as well. So finally, with the accountability, transparency, and review, actually I shouldn't say finally, but you need to put this in action, you need to have goals and metrics to measure the efficiency. So you need to be looking at indicators that monitor student outcomes and student climate. And as I said, you want to reduce the fact that a person's characteristics might be a predictor of their success in school. So you need a plan to ensure that equitable educational opportunities are provided to all students. And then you need to have some training to raise awareness. And we're going to go through some of these more in more detail in the regulation, the how aspect. Oliver, do you want to just talk about some of the main data points that might be important in this?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the ones that logically pops out in people's mind, they start thinking about academic performance and the unfortunate disparities that you see over and over, the trends with academic performance. You talk about disparities in discipline as another example. You talk about disparities in placement in special education as another example of those type things that unfortunately people accept to be the norm because the trends have unfortunately been so consistent. So that's the irony of it, right? Because we've had consistent bad trends, we accept them as being the only trends that we should have. But the reality of it is how do we then intentionally try to turn those trends around? Or adversely, the lack of participation in advanced placement courses or things of that nature becomes some of those type things, or depends on the community who's participating in extracurricular activities in certain clubs, and who's not is probably the bigger question to talk about. And just to punctuate this point, some years back here even at Shenendehowa, probably about 14 years ago, we were looking at AP scores, and we offer an abundance of AP classes for our kids, and we had a large number of kids taking AP courses. So on the surface, you would say we're doing great, but the question was who was missing from that pool of students. And once you start unpacking that, it then lends us to start thinking about where did students start being tracked differently instead of the track to reach the top of the ladder in terms of access to the most rigorous courses. And so it lends to then a look at our entire system. And so I think that, the point is I'm trying to make, when we look at data, just don't look at the data for the immediacy of that result, but look at the data in terms of what is it really telling us about our system, because what's happening today is a result of decisions that's been made in the past. So the question is, how do we remedy those decisions in our effort to move forward?
Right, right, and exactly. When you won't know if you've had success unless you look at where you are now and measure it in a concrete way. And I think that's you make a very good point there. So the next slide is, having a plan for accountability, monitoring, reviewing these metrics, how much compliance is there within the district, and what kind of progress are you making towards these goals? Are you having a positive effect? And you want to have some kind of a regular progress report. And that could be, reporting something at every board meeting. It could be reporting progress on a quarterly basis, and then maybe an annual sort of recap. Do you have a particular recommended schedule for that, Oliver? Does that sound about right? Quarterly, monthly, annually?
Yeah, so I think that the progress report should be ongoing. It shouldn't be at the end of the year and we cross our fingers and hope that the data proves out. It should be ongoing, so you can make the modifications as you move along the continuum, so to speak. And another, just a quick point I want to highlight to the whole accountability piece that is so critical. It takes the politics out of the game. This is supposed to be in a very objective process driven by the simple premise of we're trying to enhance the quality experience for all students. And so it takes politics out of it. It takes popularity out of it. It takes my view versus your view out of it and puts it dead in center. This is an objective of the system that we're all committed to realize. And so therefore we all have to come to the table with that very objective perspective and not people's own personal biases, which we all have, by the way.
Oliver, I was thinking while you were speaking, this slide and your comments along with Jessica's evidence that board members listening who are deeply committed to this work are going to understand that this is not easy. And this is going to be a comprehensive thing that we're going to do, and it's going to take a lot of time. And we may not get it right exactly in the beginning. We have to keep monitoring and adjusting exactly as Jessica said and exactly as it's spelled out on this slide. But because if boards just adopt this policy and don't really dedicate themselves to the mission of this work, I guess they can check a box that this policy was developed, but it still doesn't it doesn't meet the mark of what we're looking to do. And that's why we're so very proud to be working with you, Oliver, and your entire team at the New York State Council of School Superintendents, because as I said at the outset, this is a joint exercise.
Right, thank you. And if Jay's exactly right, this is not a magical document. This is a tool to help you in your journey. And Oliver spoke to the politics that go on sometimes, and this is going to be a community effort. But if you start from the premise that all children can learn and all children can achieve, this is how you follow it up. And you really can't be in the place where you are and not have that belief. That's what I think. So we're going to finalize the policy aspect of it with it's any policy that you adopt is really not going to be doing much good unless people are aware of it and unless the policy is enforced. So people, your whole school community needs to be aware of this policy. Maybe you want to post it in your website, have it in your registration materials, in your handbooks, and then you give it over to the superintendent to implement that policy. You do, want to have some sort of annual review, but as Oliver said, not just annually. You need to be looking at this on an ongoing basis, and then you need to be able to take action to ensure that it is being the policy is being complied with. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the next phase, which is the administrative regulation. And that's where a lot of the rubber hits the road. And we wanted to, as Mary said, we were looking at how to structure this. And we always look at, when we develop a policy, what is the board's role versus the superintendent's role? And that's why we split this into a policy and a regulation, because we know that a lot of the how does this get put into effect that is administrative in nature. And so we're not here to tell superintendents how to do their job, but this is our suggested roadmap for as a starting point. So our regulation includes 5 basic areas to eliminate and disrupt systemic inequities. To number 2, ensure systemic equity. So that's 2 separate things. You want to disrupt the inequities, and then you want to build equity. And how to do that would be to use data and metrics. The 4th one is to implement an equity lens. And the 5th one is to monitor and review. And we'll get through as much of this as we can. And then there's also an exhibit at the end, which, just to let you know, is common terms so that people have a common understanding of what terms mean. And then there's some sources and resources for additional work here. So the first part of the regulation is to eliminate and disrupt systemic inequities. And as we mentioned before, this is not necessarily easy work. This can lead to very difficult discussions, and it takes bravery and it takes courage to do so. Examining your personal biases and privileges, not easy for people. And as Mary said, this is not about blaming and shaming, but it can bring up sensitive topics for people. And acknowledging systemic oppression and promoting actions to address inequities, develop inclusive leadership, and having a shared understanding of terms. And that's where the exhibit comes in. Additionally, you want to include diverse groups of people when you are addressing the root causes. Once you find out where your inequities lie, you need to ask yourself, why does it exist? What are we doing to maybe it's something the school district is doing knowingly or unknowingly. Maybe it's not anything that is being intentionally done, but perhaps you need to find out why an inequity exists before you can do anything about it. And that's going to take a deep review. You have to figure out what are the practices that are leading to gaps. Is it discipline? Is it access to advanced courses? Are are students coming into school? Some students are maybe lesser prepared than others, and they're starting off behind academically. Modeling equity and inclusion in your business practices, and putting in place systems to report and investigate bias incidents. And as well as professional development. And Oliver, I'm not sure if you could talk to, the business practices aspect as a superintendent. You see everything across your school district, from the instructional to the business practices, and we want to make sure that equity is baked into everything.
So it's a great point, Jessica, that you bring, because I think one of the beauty of this policy, it's not intended just to implement this policy and say we're done. This policy speaks to unpacking all the processes within our system, be it our hiring processes. What are the training sequences that we use to go in? Where do we advertise? Be it our curricular review, when we look at content materials. How do we audit content material to ensure that it's diverse in nature? Looking at our practices from everything from discipline practices, our code of conduct practices, and how are those steps interpreted. So that's the beauty of this, that when you're talking about eliminating disrupt systemic inequities, you then have to think about what are the other policies that you now need to open up in order to effectively do this. So you just can't simply say, yes, we're going to do this. The question is, no, you can't, unless you're going to now open these other policies related to HR, related to curriculum instruction, related to code. Code of conduct is probably the biggest discriminatory practice policy we have, because when we look at who often receive the harshest punishment from code of conduct, it's often the kids who are also receiving the less or the least of the educational quality. That's the irony of it. The kids who are getting the less are being punished the most. So when you think about it from a very simple sense, you think, oh my God, what are we doing then? And so questioning, how do we reverse those policy language to reverse those policy actions to subsequently change those outcomes? And so that's the beauty of this particular thing. I just want to really highlight that, because when people look at these bullet points, just don't look at these bullet points for just the understanding of it. Look at the bullet points from the sense of, how do we now go and unpack other things and recognize you can't do them all at once. So, and it's worthwhile unpacking something, unpacking it well, understand the implications of it, and then moving to the next thing instead of trying to have a whole bunch of stuff unpacked at the same time and creates frustration and nothing happens.
You know, Oliver, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about my own corporate board of directors. You know, we have school board members from the entire state on our board, and a few years ago they decided that they wanted to make sure they had a perspective of people of color, a perspective that they could make sure that when they're deliberating, they wouldn't just have great intentions, but they would see this from another perspective. And so our organization adopted actually a bylaw amendment many years ago to include on our corporate board of directors on an ongoing basis a member of the Black caucus of school board members. And it's proven to be very successful because as we're having these tough conversations, the board is hearing another perspective that they definitely need. And I comment on that because of the very first bullet here, which is to make sure that we don't just do what we think is appropriate and have the best of intentions, but to make sure we understand this from another person's perspective, because we could have the greatest cure for an illness that is not present, right? So that's an important thought. Jessica, go ahead. I know your time is very limited, so I want to hear from you.
You know, and I know that there's a lot of questions that are coming in fast and furious, and we may not be able to get to them all. We may be able to get to some of them. We will try to answer them as best as we can. There was a question about hiring practices and staff considerations, and as Oliver mentioned, this is just the beginning. There's a lot of other, you know, it's a domino effect. And as part of this, this initiative, you know, the equity policy is not the beginning and the end, right? We did also start to make some suggested changes to other policies, such as professional development and hiring and curricular materials, and it's not going to stop there. And you know, one of the great things about policy, I mean, we think it's a great thing about policy, is that it's never finished. You're always going to be looking at your policy and saying, how can we do better? Is this what we want? What do we need to change? And we do that as well as school boards. So, you know, as we go forward in this journey, when we find areas that need to be addressed that are touched on by the equity policy, we will make suggestions as well. So the next section of the regulation is to ensure systemic equity, and that's when you want to you know, build a system that is more equitable from the start. So that includes being culturally responsive and including those voices that have been excluded historically. And this is not, again, just about, you know, something for minority students. This is something that will benefit all students, you know, wherever you go, because you need to have an understanding of who your neighbors are, whether it's down the street or in another state, and to be conversant in, you know, in the types of people who make up our country, especially those who have been maybe excluded, you know, up until now. So you know, and making sure that everybody feels welcome in their school. Additionally, you know, you have your district level and your building level committees to be reviewing policies and programs and procedures with an equity lens. And we'll talk a little bit about the equity lens in a minute. But then as Oliver alluded to, you want to try and remedy the overrepresentation in special education where they exist and discipline, and the underrepresented in the gifted and talented, if you have one, or advanced placement program, and try to get to what has led to those under and over representations, and how do we stop that? We did, just FYI, NYSSBA a few years back, we modified our code of conduct to include restorative practices as a response to behavior that is, you know, maybe not conducive to a good school environment. And that, I think, can help to keep students in school instead of pushing them out. And that is one part of this, as Oliver mentioned, discipline, you know, and having a disproportionality is one piece of this. So then the another aspect of ensuring equity is to attract and retain and support a diverse workforce. as well as a positive environment. And I mentioned before, culturally responsive instruction. I know that I've heard Oliver speak before about the diverse workforce. I don't know if you wanted to, for purposes of our audience here today, say a few words about that, because we did get a question about workforce diversity.
Absolutely. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. One is, what's your hiring process? What's your training process of people on your hiring committee? How do you avoid what I call the gatekeeper effect of people only hiring people to remind them of themselves, and perpetuating that over and over? Look at where you not only where you recruit or advertise, but what is actually saying. When you read your advertisement, who do you think that actually speaks to? So again, taking and also asking someone else other than yourself or someone other like you to read this and tell me, what do you see when you read this? What does it say to you as a person from a different background, different perspective, as well? And more importantly, when people come on board, how do you support them to success? And oftentimes, you hear people like, well, we're all professionals, but I would venture to guess, if you ask any one person, if I'm going to put you in a place where you're the only one person that looks like that and no one speaks to you, how long you think you're going to be successful? Doesn't matter how competent you are, psychologically, you're going to want to be out of that place. So how do you create that environment where people have an equity mindset? And so sometimes you may not be able to diversify in terms of race, but you could certainly, from professional development, diversify in terms of people's mindset, in terms of their embrace of the significant diversity that exists. Just one quick point, Jessica, I also want to point out that this talks about district and building committees. It's so important that boards don't see this as a board thing or a district thing. It has to be a collective partnership. Board members have to be representative members on these committees, so everyone knows that everyone is in it. And the game belongs to everyone and not just certain people, because I think that's when things become an add-on versus being a part of the fabric of the school district and the school community at large.
Now, one thing that we did not specifically speak to in this policy or regulation was the appointment of a chief equity officer. I'm not sure if your school district, Shenendehowa, has done that, or if you have experience with that. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but I know that some districts have appointed somebody in the district as having chief responsibility for being the point person on that.
So I've seen it work very well, and I've seen it work awfully, in the sense that all of a sudden that person becomes the only person that has to deal with equity. And this equity isn't a person thing or one-time thing. It's an organizational culture, organizational practice, organizational policy thing. And so if people are going down that road, there needs to be not only empowerment for that individual, but there also need to be structures so that the work of that individual, or the work that individual is trying to facilitate, can actually have different multiple homes in which that work grows and materialize into a larger systemic approach. And so oftentimes you hear people hire that person and they wash their hands. Yes, we did it. Unfortunately, that person is probably the most frustrated person in that organization, because they have no authority to make any changes, period. And they're talking about a topic that most people, because they've already washed their hands with, don't necessarily want to have the conversation. So the question is, if you're going to do it, it still requires the same things that this policy speaks to right now.
Right. Yes.
Jessica, as you're going through the rest of these, just to remind you, we have about 11 minutes left, and we have 11 questions too. So I know you have a Herculean task here, and we keep interrupting you. So try to give some quick hits, because we want to make sure we get to people's questions too.
Absolutely.
Okay?
So
Sure.
The next part, we'll talk about the data and the metrics that we've already, talked about a little bit. What are you supposed to be looking at here, right? Access to educational opportunities, and as Oliver mentioned, not just the curricular, but the extracurricular as well. Your other achievement data, the suspensions, the discipline, the attendance. But then also, where is the funding going? Where's your federal funding going? Where is your state and local funding going? And I know that one of the questions that came in had to do about, funding is tight, and where are we supposed to get funding for this? And it may be that there needs to be some reallocation, and the students that need more need to get more, and the students that need less maybe need to get less. And it's an unfortunate thing that we don't have always everything that we need, but then there's other areas that don't cost anything, right? When you hire somebody, as Oliver said, hiring the right person with the right mindset. When you have to purchase instructional materials, make sure that they're free of bias, make sure that they're representative of other cultures. So those are things that you can do that don't necessarily cost anything. But if you're not looking at where is the money going, you can't fully allocate it where it needs to be. So these are some other metrics that you would want to be looking at. What are the facilities condition? Where are students learning? Are there some schools that are maybe a little bit nicer than others? And obviously you can't swap out a school, but when you're looking at where are improvements going to be made, where are we going to be spending facilities money? Where is the need most great? But then also bringing in family and community engagement. Well, I'm sure there's probably some schools that have a lot greater engagement and some schools that maybe have lesser, and that's maybe an untapped resource that you want to ask yourself, why are some parents and families not engaging with us? Are we being culturally responsive? Are we being culturally respectful to our families? Or are we just saying, well, they didn't contact us, so what are we going to do? Here's where we're talking about the equity lens, which is whenever you're making decisions, ask yourself questions that are geared towards ensuring equity. So we want to be intentional about your decisions, and these questions are meant to guide you. So here are the 5 questions that we've pulled. Now, there's no legal definition of an equity lens. There's not even one agreement of what an equity lens question should be. So we, as Mary said, we looked at what are other people doing. We picked out these 5, which we thought were representative, to first fully define what the action is, and then look at what is the impact of that action, and are there disparities? Why? And then who is missing in the discussion, and how can we mitigate these disparities? So if you're asking yourself these questions whenever you make decisions, that will help to put you on the right path. So then the final aspect of the regulation is about monitoring effectiveness and reviewing the policy. So we already talked about that, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And I did just want to very quickly move through, I know we only have 7 minutes left or so, some of the definitions in our exhibit. We talk about achievement gap and how it is different from an opportunity gap and a learning gap. Cultural competence. Oh, and it's worth noting, by the way, when we talk about cultural competence, that there was a change recently to the state regulations about professional learning, and that you do have to now include elements of cultural competence and cultural responsiveness. So that's not something that you would be taking on out of nowhere. That's something that you're now required to do by the state. So here's some additional definitions that we've come up with, or well, I don't say we've come up with them. We drew from sources, experts in this field. And then we've got, these are the sources that we drew from with these definitions. And there's additional resources that someone had asked about, where can we find, culturally responsive education? Where can we find, other things about equity lens? This exhibit is very exhaustive and includes a lot of resources. And then, as I mentioned, we did some work on some related policies to start with. That's what this was here. And just, the work will continue as we go on. So Jay, I don't know if you have questions.
So I think, Jessica, that was fantastic. And hopefully everybody listening in knows that we're very limited. People have a very short attention spans while looking at your computers, but we don't want to minimize the importance of this work. And so it's more important that you see what our resources are and the things that you can explore still further than to think that we've provided you short shrift and we really have dealt with this in a kind of incomplete way. So I think if you look through all this stuff, you'll see it's certainly not incomplete by any means. And I think those definitions are important because those of you who ever look at laws, the state of New York, for example, every time you get to a law, there's a new section, it starts with definitions. So they define for us what we're talking about. So it is very important that we have you examine that so we can all be on the same page, because if we're going to solve a problem, let's make sure, as Oliver said, we are all cognizant and in agreement as to what the problem is that we're going to solve. And whether we do a good job or a bad job, that will be what history judges us. But let's make sure we set our path. So in our remaining moments, let me see how many of these questions we can get through. The first one is, can you comment on what we mean by a culturally responsive instructional practice? And maybe I'll ask our superintendent friend to help us with that. That's your expertise.
I mean, so that varies from it could be pronouns when you talk about sexual and gender orientation. It could be race references. I mean, you have books that, quite frankly, with you depict history in such a despicable manner that absolutely turns a kid off. It could be, quite frankly, the approach of the teacher in terms of who the teacher is calling on as right or wrong, or disparaging class by not calling on or only acknowledging when wrong. So that whole notion comes from understanding the student, understanding the content, and also understanding the larger context of what a classroom environment is supposed to provide.
Okay, and this is an impossible task, the next question, which I'll also turn to you, Oliver, with your permission. This individual is asking if you could please recommend tactics for attracting a more diverse faculty. That's a 5-hour conversation in and of itself, but what would you say in a minute or two that you could recommend here?
So the first, I was going to be joking to Jay, say just start with cardboard cutouts of me all around the community. Now, I think that the main thing is that, one, the board, the community has to first have that as an outward part of their narrative. It has to be stated outwardly that we want a diverse community. We want diversity in our ranks. Once that happens, then you start investigating your respective policies and practices. But I have to tell you, that has to be the first thing, because if administrators think that boards will not accept certain candidates will not come to the board. If board demands certain candidates, administrators will get certain candidates to come to the board. So it's that reciprocal relationship that has to be declared, and declared loudly.
Right, and I think the beauty, and I think you would agree with this, of this policy is up front, we would all be committing ourselves, the Board of Education and the administrative staff, to this particular mission. So we wouldn't have to have the conversation about, oh, we want you to get a more diverse workforce, because we would have already committed to that, right? So that's a good starting place.
Can I just interject?
Please, of course, yes.
I know that we have additional equity webinars in the works, NYSSBA does, and I believe one of them is going to be focusing on a diverse workforce. So I would want to just put a shout out for that. And then I think there was also a session at convention, which FYI, if you missed, you can always go back and get a second shot at. And I think there was something in there about, as well, like diverse hiring practices. And there's a lot that can be done. Actually, I learned a lot in this mission here too. If you just Google, how do I, diverse hiring practices, there's a lot out there.
There's tons of information out there. And I also think that whether or not your district will be welcoming to a person of color first. Have those talks.
Yes, and Jessica, thank you for pointing out the fact that we have done, we have other webinars. Our friends from the Leadership Development Unit have done a marvelous job, and I'm so glad you reminded me to make mention of that. So folks, please tune into those as well. Here's another question. What is the role of parents and the at-large community to reinforce what schools are trying to do?
That is a good question. Oliver, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, absolutely, Jay. I think that's what it comes down to. When the rubber hits the road, school board members are supposed to be representative of their respective communities, parents and everyone else. And if they're not, they need to make sure then that they create opportunities to have those engagements, because at the end of the day, if a community is biased in their perspective, all this is for naught. So we need to ensure we have those honest conversations so people can interrogate their own thinking and ask themselves, why did I think that way versus some other way, and have it in a way it's about being constructive in a dialogue. It's not about a debate, it's about a dialogue. And so that's a great opportunity that boards of education should have and can have, because they truly do represent, or should represent, the entire community and not just factions of the community.
And Oliver, while you have the floor here, this person's asking a question about, how would we address the equity problem in education when, a lot of the systemic issues are steeped in collective bargained contracts. Now, I'm not assuming that the collective bargaining agreement is racist in tone, but I think the question really is if you know what you need to address and then you have limitations with respect to the collective bargaining agreement, how do you work with the union to achieve success without bankrupting your school district in this horrible economic circumstance that we find ourselves in now?
Well, Jay, when you go back to the very first slide that Jessica pointed out, and I fundamentally believe that educators, teachers who are union members, and you notice I put that first, educators, teachers, union members, they came into this business to educate children. And if we fundamentally believe that, we, collective, all of us as employees or as members of our school community, that's where the conversation starts and stops. And if there are things, be it in policies or contract, that prevents that, guess what? The Board of Education has a responsibility to say these are non-starters. Unless we start to address these things that's going to be beneficial to our students, why should we invest resources in things that we know that are not beneficial? It's counterintuitive when you think about it from that perspective. And so boards of education has a tremendous voice to talk about these. It's not about union versus anti-union, because I fundamentally believe that people who come into education with their firm belief of helping to move children to where they ought to be as adults. So I think we have to come back to that and have those honest conversations and not perpetuate things that we know that are, quite frankly, detrimental to our students.
Right. I assume that you would agree with one of the former slides indicating that when we're starting this conversation, we have a conversation with the whole education community. So in other words, if they're committed to the work, they being the teachers union or the non-instructional unit, then it's how do we get to yes, as opposed to how do we fight each other? There's something here that, and again, I know I'm over, but with everybody's indulgence, perhaps we'll spend 5 minutes over the time so we can get to as many of these questions. I'd rather be negatively judged on that than to cut off questions. Is there a suggested curriculum to achieve understanding regarding historical inequalities? Mary, I know you had some resources that you were commending them to. What would you say about that one?
I know I ran into some few out there. I will have to take a look, and if you have the person's name, we can get back to them.
Yes, and yeah. So let's try to make sure we get that out for folks. I know that there's a question here, and this is obviously a very valid question, which is, I believe in the work, but how do we pay for any of this given the pandemic and the dire effect of 20% budget cuts looming over us? How do we get this funded? Oliver, I'm not going to ask you how you get it funded, but I know that you're committed to this work in your district. From an administrative perspective, when you have to, you're kind of like MacGyver, right? Superintendents have to be MacGyver. Somehow you have to make it work, right? So what's the short answer to that question?
The short answer, Jay, this is the work. It's embedded in all the work that we do. We spend money every day, and we need to make sure that the funds that we're investing are being invested from a perspective of equity, that we are truly investing funds to try to address the varying needs of all kids. So it's not about additional money. If we have more money, we could do more things and hopefully better. And so the question then is, we're going to spend money regardless. The question is, are we spending money in the wisest way? And a part of that wisdom is defined by equity, looking at things from the equity lens. That's why I think it's so important when you think about that. And it happens in all aspects of what we do when we expend resources. Who's getting the resources and who's not?
Thank you. And Jay, actually, if I could mention something. One of the other, I've been listening to a lot of different equity talks from superintendents and board members across the state and across the country. And I believe it was during one of those talks where somebody mentioned your budget is a moral document. Your budget is where you have your priorities set. So as Oliver mentioned, you have money that you are going to be spending anyway. So it's how are you going to be spending it?
Right. And I think Oliver's point is beautifully stated, because if we leave this out because we quote can't afford it unquote, what have we done? You know, how we haven't committed ourselves to anything. But I do think, you know, the individuals who are asking these questions are, you know, shouldn't be faulted, because the state of New York, the federal government requires all of these things of us, and the resources don't appear to be there. I'm going to close it out now, but I know there's a comment here about making sure that we treat our staff as fairly as we do our students, particularly our staff of color. And you already got into that before when we were talking, Oliver, about making sure that it's a welcoming environment, et cetera. And there are a whole bunch of comments here, people, you know, thanking us for ensuring that this is a mission as opposed to just a task, right? In other words, you can't just adopt this policy and say one and done. It's a lot of commitment for this work, and it's an ongoing commitment, because as we indicated before, and Jessica, you so beautifully talked about the metrics. If we don't look at whether we're moving the mark in a positive way, we could have committed ourselves and we're not making a difference. So we have to keep doing this on an ongoing basis. So with that, we are over our time, and I thank you all for those of you who stuck with us. Oliver, I love you. You're like the greatest friend we have, and thank you for always being here for us, particularly on this work, because from the bottom of our hearts, there's nothing more important than this. And I'm sorry it's taken the nation to figure this out with all of the things that people have seen around their news feeds. But the good news for us is this is our lane. Public education is the lane to make the change, and we're very committed to that. We want to work with you. I know my corporate board of directors is. I know so is yours, Oliver. And we thank all of the members of your Inclusivity and Diversity Commission. We know that one of your individuals, Dr. Padillo, who's just been made Superintendent of the Year. We congratulate him on a wonderful job that he's doing in his school district. And Jessica and Mary, thank you so much for doing what you do on a daily basis. You are the unsung heroes, because at the end of the day, if we don't get policy right, we've done nothing as a school boards association, because policy is where it all begins and ends, after, of course, you hire great people like Oliver Robinson. So with that, let me close out the day and say thank you so much, and please contact us if you have any further questions. Sorry that there were a couple questions we couldn't get to, but I really appreciate everybody's time and your commitment. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for watching this program produced by the New York State School Boards Association.